Hey everyone, and welcome to Brent's Notepad, where ideas become insight. I'm Brent Shelton, inviting you to think deeper, lead better, and live more intentionally. In each episode, I dive into big questions and meaningful ideas drawn from books, research, and real life. In today's episode, we're unpacking Chapter 9 of Exploring Leadership, the second edition written by Richard Bolden, Jonathan Gosling, and Beverly Hawkins. In this chapter, the authors shift from the societal perspectives of leadership and begin to discuss what they describe as the cross-cutting and emerging perspectives of leadership by leading us through tough, enduring, and essential conversations. In doing so, they tackle topics such as gender, inclusion, technology, ethics, and much more. So let's dive in. The authors begin Chapter 9 with a fun little exercise that I'm going to expand upon a little bit. First, imagine a leader. Now imagine someone who is a good leader, someone who is an ethical leader. Now imagine someone who is a good, ethical, and political leader. Okay, name your leader. Seriously, pick somebody. Did anybody picture a female leader? I know I didn't. Now, the purpose of this exercise is not to make anyone out to be sexist or even to suggest that we are opposed to women in leadership. Rather, it's intended to wake us up to the stark reality that gender stereotypes are ingrained in our communities, organizations, and our nations as a masculine practice. And this is why the authors introduce us to the idea of gender mainstreaming, which means that gender equality is embedded in all aspects of work and leadership. It's not a separate issue. In other words, gender differences are not simply the result of biology, but rather the result of cultural and social norms and practices. Leadership scholars and practitioners have long studied gender equality in the workplace and women who pursue or hold roles of authority. However, despite research on gender equality, it's been a slow and uneven process. For example, for nearly 50 years, women have faced persistent barriers to progressing beyond middle management to executive roles, through what Bolden 1978 calls the glass ceiling, or because of the unseen barriers that prevent women from advancing to high-level positions in the workplace. Furthermore, when women do find their way to break through the glass ceiling, they are pushed off the glass cliff, which is the phenomenon described by Ryan and Haslam 2005, which suggests that women tend to be promoted into executive roles when an organization is struggling, thereby putting them at much higher risk of failure and subsequently the organization blaming the failure to the personal failings of the woman who's in charge, rather than recognizing she was just placed on a sinking ship in the first place. Now, I'm sure you all know that workplace equality, diversity, and inclusion goes far beyond gender differences and encompasses numerous characteristics such as age, disabilities, marriage, religion, sexual orientation, and other protective classes. So, to address the issues of inequality, the authors suggest that leaders should develop the practice of inclusive leadership. Inclusive leadership is more than simply creating the systems in place for equality, diversity, and inclusion. It requires leaders to deeply and honestly reflect on their own biases and prejudices. Here, the authors point us to Burke and Titus 2019, who identify 6 characteristics of inclusive leaders, which are commitment, humility, awareness of biases, curiosity about others, cultural intelligence, and effective collaboration. Another leadership practice that authors highlight to address workplace inequality is that of compassionate leadership. Here, the authors point us to Atkins and Parker 2012, who identify 4 characteristics of compassionate leaders. First, attending. This is being present and listening. Second, understanding. This is taking the time to genuinely understand other experiences and perspectives. Third, empathizing. This is acknowledging and feeling the struggles of others without becoming too overwhelmed. And lastly, helping. This is taking thoughtful and constructive actions to help others. In conjunction, inclusive and compassionate leadership requires leaders to be emotionally intelligent and honest with themselves and others to the blind spots they may have. It requires deep work on ourselves as leaders and working to foster environments where everyone can thrive. Okay, with this understanding, the authors shift to another hot topic, which is the ways in which technology has infiltrated the leadership discussion. And here, I just want to pause and throw a quick shout out to my fellow millennials who have all seen firsthand the ways in which life has evolved through the introduction of technology. Who remembers when their parents got their first computer, or that awful dial-up tone, and floppy disks? Or my personal favorite, the OGs of social media, MySpace and AOL Messenger. All of this and more has completely reshaped leadership in profound ways. Leadership scholars have taken two approaches to understanding how technology impacts leadership practices. The first is the macro approach, which looks at how digitalization impacts organizations as a whole. The second is the micro approach, which looks at how digitalization impacts the leader-follower relationship and interactions, both of which highlight the ways organizations interact with each other, their customers, their employees, and the population at large. The overwhelming observation is that digitalization at the micro and macro levels increases separation. In other words, it puts distance between people. And consequently, with separation, scholars have seen that we are becoming more willing to ignore each other's feelings. The connection between separation and immoral activity, while previous to the digital age, is best explained through the experiment conducted by Milgram, 1963, where he hypothesized that people would willingly obey orders from authority if they could not see their victims. And to test this, he recruited participants who were instructed to administer electric shocks to a learner for wrong answers, with the shocks increasing in intensity. Although the shocks weren't real, most participants believed that they were and continued delivering them when they were pressured by the experimenter or the person in authority. Importantly, participants who were asked to shock the learners were placed in one room with the authority figure while the learner was separated in another room behind a thin wall. The results showed that ordinary people can commit harmful actions under authority's influence with a margin of separation. And with this in mind, we can see why virtual workplaces and social media platforms can pave the way for unethical leadership practices. Begging the question, should social media influencers who generate these massive followings be required to participate in some form of leadership training? Perhaps they should just listen to this podcast. You let them know that I said that's the answer. All jokes aside, the digital transformation has significantly impacted leadership practices and is now paving the way for new and inventive ways to lead. For example, the authors highlight what Schmidt and Van Dellen 2022 call algorithmic leadership. This is where artificial intelligence can take on managerial roles such as decision-making, delegation, and performance appraisal. Schmidt and Van Dellen 2022 go on to provide an example of this by looking at Uber drivers. First, an Uber driver logs into their app, essentially punching in. They are given instructions where to go, which is essentially receiving a task or an assignment from their manager. And third, they're rated by their customer, which is analyzed, and this is essentially their performance review, all of which is a demonstration on how algorithmic leadership shapes the livelihood of Uber drivers. And while some might not prefer to be algorithmically rated, digital transformation is not all bad. It's actually created a space for digital support groups and online networks where people can find a sense of belonging with people who hold similar roles all over the world. All right, whether we're dealing with inequality or digital transformation within leadership, they both are solid reminders that leadership practices must incorporate ethical practices. Here, the authors introduce us to the idea of ethical leadership, which, as I alluded to in today's day and age, is not optional, it's essential. Just like the rest of our leadership practices, ethical leadership is inherently complex and messy. It requires introspection, self-criticism, and a commitment to social responsibility. Now, whether or not we believe that ethics and leadership should just go hand in hand, the authors remind us that ethical leadership practices fundamentally impact individuals, organizations, and society as a whole. All right, those are the key components of Chapter 9. Let's take some time and reflect. First, that opening exercise really stuck with me. When I pictured a leader, I did not think of a woman. And it's not that I don't value female leadership, but it shows me how deeply our cultural norms shape the way we imagine leadership. This makes me wonder, who do I automatically recognize as a leader and who do I oftentimes overlook? And second, the discussion on inclusive and compassionate leadership, this reminds me that systems alone will not fix inequality. Real leadership practice, it's personal. It means we have to do the work, checking our blind spots, practicing humility, and making sure people feel heard, seen, and supported. In other words, inclusion isn't a checklist, it's a practice. And third, the connection between technology and Milgram's experiment hit me hard. Just like separation made it easier for people to obey harmful orders, technology today can make it easy for us to become detached from each other's humanity. Whether we're leading online, managing virtually, or just showing up on social media, this is a call to lead ethically, building connection instead of letting distance create indifference. That's it for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Brent's Notepad, where ideas become insight. Until next time, lead better, think deeper, and live more intentionally.